Hello. Welcome. I am John Brisson, your host. Welcome to a We've Read the Documents live stream. Hope everybody's doing well out there, wherever you are. Today we're going to discuss Craig J. Spence, who was a reporter, the Republican lobbyist, pedophile, and Brownstone operator. So we're going to read some newspaper clippings that I found. We're going to read from Henry Vincent's book, Confessions of a D.C. Madam. And we're going to see what we can find out about Craig J. Spence and his life. So, from the North Adams transcript, April 19th, 1967. April 21st, 1967. Let us begin. NASC speaker to tell of Vietnam experiences. Craig J. Spence, New England news editor and special correspondent for the Mutual Broadcasting System, will be featured as a speaker for the Blank of the Lecture and Concert Program Series, to be presented Tuesday, April 25th at 8 p.m. in Hoosac Hall Theater, North Adams State College. Mr. Spence will report on recent experiences in Vietnam and will evaluate how the story has been reported in contrasting with his first-hand knowledge of the day-to-day drama in that troubled land. Mr. Spence not only interviewed a great many people, but actually flew missions and accompanied troops in combat as part of his special assignment. In his 8 years of news reporting and interviewing, Mr. Spence has been expelled from Cuba and has filled stories of Bombay, Calcutta, Karachi, Athens, and Saigon for the Mutual Network. He was also radio, television, press secretary to the former governor Endicott Peabody of Massachusetts, and serves as a press secretary to the Speaker of the House of Representatives of Massachusetts. In addition to his report on Vietnam, Mr. Spence will comment on news media in the United States and methods of reporting. The public is invited. The final program in the series will be on Tuesday, May 9th, by Roger Conklin, the well-known marine biologist who has been a frequent guest on several television programs. Okay, so Craig Spence was a journalist covering his experiences over there during the Vietnam War. So that gives us a good background on that. From the Tampa Tribune, Tuesday, December 29th, 1981. Thirst for information. Craig Spence monitors the United States pulse for Japanese. Who is this Craig J. Spence? Washingtonian magazine asked on its gossip page recently. The item went on to describe Spence's Kalorama house as a mansion and to detail his propensity for foppish clothes, name-dropping, fancy cars, and parties peopled by prominent conservatives. But the article did not say that Spence is paid $144,000 a year annually, and more than that each year in expenses by a non-profit group affiliated with a faction of Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party to gather information on the heartbeat of Washington. In the course of these activities, Spence has taken numerous congressional staffers and other notables on trips to Japan to speak at seminars. He also paid several government officials about $400 each to speak at the Executive Development Seminar held last summer at Georgetown University, so the Jesuit University. The seminar was primarily for young Japanese executives. And it would, that was also around the time, too, that if I remember correctly, many Chinese students at Georgetown University were going to the Finders W Street apartments. Moreover, he commissioned research papers from at least one government official who was still on the U.S. payroll at the time. Herman Franzen, who currently is an official of the International Energy Agency in France, said he wrote 2 research papers for Spence while serving with the Library of Congress Congressional Research Service. Franzen said his superiors confirmed that he was given permission to sell the papers on world energy demand for a total of $1,500 because they were not his primary field, the law of the sea. That's really interesting. Admiralty law. Later, Franzen went to the Department of Energy, where he held a top-secret Q clearance. Wow, this guy's... Whoa. Might have to do some investigation on him. He's pretty well connected. Admiralty law, writing papers on world energy demand. Mark from Housatonic Live. I want to pay attention to this Herman Fransenson guy. You actually might know about him, but I think there might be something there parallel to your work. Director of the Office of International Affairs, that he had access to intelligence materials and information about foreign companies. While he was in that post, his wife was paid $1,500 by Spence to write a paper on the law of the sea. Franson said he and his wife both hold doctorate degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Spence, a former ABC newsman in Vietnam, so he worked with ABC, has declined reported requests for an interview with Media General News Service. Instead, his attorney asked for a list of written questions. Spence didn't provide answers to some of the questions. He refused, however, to disclose the full identity of the people who did research for him. A form he filed with the Justice Department under the Foreign Agents Registration Act lists the last names and first initials of people whom he paid for research. Spence's activities show the Japanese thirst for information about the United States. According to his Foreign Agents Registration Group, Foreign Bill with the Justice Department, he's employed by the Policy Study Group based in Tokyo. The groups list a number of Japanese parliament members and industry leaders as officers. The chairman is Eta Susuburu Shina, a parliament member and leader of conservative faction of Japan's ruling political party. The Policy Study Group is funded by the Japanese government and by industrial organizations according to the registration statement. The form shows the Policy Study Group paid for trips to Japan by a number of government officials, including Stephen Roberts, former chief economist of the Senate Banking Committee, and Council for National Policy member, I added that part, but he is, and High Frontier, Daniel O. Graham, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, several staffers of the Congressional Research Service, and other congressional staffers. Remember Daniel O. Graham. So Daniel O. Graham worked with the Policy Study Group with Craig J. Spence. And he's a major member of the Council for National Policy in the 1980s and a big member of the Reagan administration. Remember him later when he's quoted to talk about Spence in the Washington Times article and what he says. Those who made the trips said they were valuable for both for themselves and the Japanese. It was a very intensive time, and there was no vacation to it, said Alva M. Bowen Jr., a specialist in the national defense for the Congressional Research Service. If you're doing analysis in that part of the world, it's valuable. Bowen and Fransenson visit Tokyo at Spence's invitation, but before Spence had moved to Washington from Tokyo, he did not register as a foreign agent until he moved there in 1979. In his written statement to Media General, Spence described the Policy Study Group as providing a seminar lecture service. Numerous officials, including Senator John Glenn, Democrat from Ohio, and Senator Frank Murkowski, Republican of Alaska. Well, guess who his daughter is? Lisa Murkowski. Very interesting. Has spoken at Spence's small afternoon gatherings. Both American and Japanese officials come to these. Associates say Spence has described his political leanings as somewhat to the right of Genghis Khan. He apparently believes American society must become more orderly, somewhat in the fashion of the Japanese society, they said. He's a character, said Robert Russell, staff director of the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Economic Policy. He seems to have very strong opinions on everything and tends to be aggressive and pushy. He's an individual, he doesn't blend in with the crowd. He hosted a Saturday talk show on WRC radio until recently, and it's a contributing editor of a magazine called Defense and Foreign Affairs, an international publication that features advertisements for military equipment. Ira Allen, who covers Congress for United Press International, has done research for Spence on the side, including profiles of top administrative officials, including White House aides James Baker, Council for National Policy member Ed Meese, which I added that, and Michael Deaver. Spence wanted to know if so-and-so likes to drink or likes to stay up at night, or has a bad temper, Allen said. Allen explained that he was told the information would be used by Japanese businessmen who wanted to be good hosts meeting United States officials. Despite working for Spence over several years, Allen said he has always harbored doubts about what Spence was actually doing with his reports, questions that Spence turned aside. Allen said he continued to work because the money was good. Why would Spence need that blackmail? It wasn't for the Japanese. Who was it for? I guess we'll find out. Detroit Free Press, February 1982. Washington Insider. His clients are well informed. Craig J. Spence finds much time to admire in Oriental society. He likes to tell the story of a Japanese food service manager who, after some of his customers suffered food poisoning, committed suicide as a way of apologizing. Now that's what I call quality control, said Spence, who is something of a mystery man and dresses in Edwardian dandy style. Spence, 41, also is a former television correspondent who now wears many hats, including international business consultant, party host, registered foreign agent, and something called research journalist. Spence can be equally pitchy. In the assessments of Washington events and personalities, it provides his clients, among them a number of American multinational companies, and the Tokyo-based Policy Study Group, a nonprofit group financed by Japanese business interests and affiliated with a faction of Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party. But what most impresses, if not benefits his clients, is his ability to master the social and political chemistry of the city, to make and use important connections, and to bring together policymakers, power brokers, and opinion shapers at parties and seminars. There seems to be an inexhaustible demand in Washington for the sort of things Spence offers. To unravel the mysteries of the capital, special interest groups, both foreign and domestic, retain lawyers, consultants, lobbyists, and public relations specialists by a score, although few cut as broad a swath. Spence, whose personal phone book and party guest list constitute a who's who in Congress, government, and journalism, is hired by his clients as much from whom he knows as what he knows. So Spence insists that he provides important, hard-nosed information and research analysis to his customers, enabling them to make decisions and moves, which makes greater confidence and skill. For example, when Richard Allen's troubles began, Spence says he wrote off the White House National Security Advisor as a burnt lance without brains, and told clients he would not survive questions about his judgment. Referring to Allen's acceptance of 2 watches from Japanese friends, Spence said he too had been given watches, but I always gave them to my butler. He also seemed to predict the downfall of the Shah of Iran and for his clients 6 months before it happened, and more recently told them the Camp David Accords are dead. After a visit to El Salvador last year, he said he advised his clients to stay away. CMP was involved in the El Salvadorian Civil War. Very interesting. Those assessments bring in a 6-figure income, says Spence, who likes to live elegantly and a bit mysteriously, although he occasionally adds a zesty personal perspective to Washington and world developments. Spence spends a good part of his time arranging for others to explain political, economic, and social events to his clients, especially the Japanese. Towards the end, Spence stages black-tie parties at his house in a fashionable Colorama section of the Capitol and seminars at local university campuses to bring together American and Japanese businessmen, government officials, scholars, and journalists who figure in the city's power equation. He calls the seminars Operation Sunshine. That's interesting. Explaining they are designed to give the Japanese and Americans a better understanding of each other and issues. Reporters, he said, are always invited. A Washington Post columnist wrote of Spence 2 years ago, "Not since Ethel Kennedy used to give her famous Hickory Hill seminars for great minds of our times during the days of Camelot has anyone staged seminars successfully on the continuing social basis in Washington, and that's what Craig Spence has been doing." Well, that columnist, I think Spence was doing a lot more things. Very, very similar to Jeffrey Epstein. Spence is like the right Jeffrey Epstein. Not as rich, but, and the nexus... Actually, no, I'm mistaken. Spence is actually more like Lex Wexner. He's a little bit higher up in the totem pole, as we'll see. Because it's more like Lawrence E. King was more Jeffrey Epstein. And when I read from Harry Vincent's book Confessions of a D.C. Madam, you'll see why, and the role that Craig J. Spence played over as being a higher-up boss compared to Lawrence E. King, even though Spence ended up being assassinated and Lawrence E. King didn't, which is very interesting. Indeed, his parties do glitter with notables, from ambassadors to television stars, from senators to senior State Department officials. According to Spence, Richard Nixon is a friend. So is John Mitchell. Eric Severide is termed an old dear friend. Senator John Glenn is a good friend. And Peter Ustinov is an old friend. Richard Nixon. It's not a one-way street. Knowing Spence can be good business for government officials, members of Congress and their staffs, and even some journalists who cash in on it by accepting speaking and writing fees. Most of the time it all works smoothly, but occasionally the players find themselves on slippery ground. Take, for example, 4 Washington reporters who said they were shocked to find their names on a Justice Department form Spence filled as registered foreign agent. Spence had hired them to do research work. The reporters contend it never bothered to them of his foreign agent status. Nonsense, he said. I report everything. I am fastidious about reporting everything I do. I'm completely in the open, and I told them that. The reporter Sarah McClendon, who runs McClendon News Agency, and Ira Allen, Gregory Gordon, and Robert McKay of United Press International said they would not have done research for Spence if they known he was a foreign agent. It's weird. Like, Spence is like a spy, a reporter, a big part of the Fourth Estate, a Brownstone operator, a homosexual pedophile, an intelligence gatherer like Marianne Petty. It's like he's like everything rolled into one. Okay. So, we got a couple of things before we get to that. So let's talk about when Harry Vincent, who was running Harry Vincent was originally a funeral home operator. I can't remember exactly where in the United States offhand. It's been a while since I read the book. Somewhere in the Midwest, if I remember. So he, Craig Spence, later moved to the Washington, D.C. area and started running an escort, homosexual escort ring. But he claims using above the age of 18. And it was Craig Spence and Lawrence E. King that reached out to him and tried to bring him into what was happening during the Franklin scandal. So, let us begin. I had been in business for a year or so when I answered the casket hotline. The caller said his name was Craig Spence, and I found it to be quite garrulous. Typically, the initial phone call placed to me by clients was brief, and they often provided a pseudonym, but Spence disclosed he was a lobbyist who lived in the D.C. upscale Kalorama neighborhood. He made a point of mentioning that he had a black MasterCard, which carried a $1 million line of credit. Spence then told me he had bought 2 homes in the posh neighborhood and bought a corridor between the 2. Spence said he had lived in one of the homes and his security lived in the other home. He requested a young boyish escort, 18 or 19 years old. I phoned Jimmy, and he sent an escort to Spence's home. 2 hours later, Spence phoned again, requesting a second escort, which Jimmy quickly dispatched to his residence. At that time, I found my conversations with Spence extremely perplexing, and I'll forever really regret the day he had contacted me. Spence started phoning me almost every day, and he spent up to $20,000 a month on escorts, becoming my most prolific and lucrative client. The vast sums he spent on escorts translated into well over 100 sessions a month. I was puzzled by his exorbitant expenditures, so I questioned the various escorts who have been dispatched to his residence about the respective encounters with Spence. Some described bacchanalian orgies. Other escorts who have had one-on-one encounters with Spence described his penchant for extreme depravity. He was fond of being shackled, feathered, and whipped, and he also had a predilection for being beaten and urinated upon. Spence was certainly an enigma to me, because I sincerely wondered how he became so deranged. The revelations unfurled by the escorts who called on him prompted me to send extremely seasoned escorts to his house. I had been interacting with Spence over the phone for a couple of months when he invited me to his Kalorama home. Given the anecdotes that were conveyed to me by the escorts who had dealt with Spence face to face, I felt apprehensive. When I drove to his home, I was solely proud down Wyoming Avenue. I noticed Spence's 2-story brick home. Walking to the front door, I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. A tall, muscular man in a pricey blue suit answered the door. He was in his early 30s, and he had a square, chiseled face, somber blue eyes, and dark brown hair. After I introduced myself, he invited me into the marble foyer, and then shepherded me into the second-floor office. An oriental rug rested on the office marble floor, and intricately carved teakwood panels decorated the walls. As I was directed to sit in front of Spence's desk, I glanced at the photographs on the walls. The photographs were quite formal and showed Spence standing next to various older men in suits. The only individuals I recognized in the photographs were Ronald Reagan and Bob Dole, and both were standing next to Spence with gaping smiles. Both Ronald Reagan and Bob Dole were Council for National Policy members, and very friendly with the CNP. I was slightly surprised that he didn't seem to have any picture of his family or family members. Craig Spence sat behind an immense cherrywood desk, wearing an Edwardian cut plaid suit, white shirt, and a black silk tie. Although Spence was in his 40s, he had a youthful blanched face. His thinning sandy blonde hair was parted to the left, and he had a well-groomed brown mustache. A pair of brown-framed designer glasses rest on the end of his nose. And he glanced upward over his glasses, and as he focused his icy blue eyes on me. He leaned forward in the chair and introduced himself without extending his hand. Spence certainly didn't come across as the reprobate described by the escorts, but rather he appeared to be a refined gentleman. After Spence's perfunctory introduction, he launched into a long-winded soliloquy. His initial remarks were a resume of sorts. He said that he was a lobbyist and as well as a consultant for various international interests in Japan and the healthcare industry. Healthcare industry, I didn't know that. Spence told me that he had friends who were perched at the pinnacle of power. He emphatically stated that he had the reins to omniscient. I know how to say this word. Omniscient. And he had the ability to make a life-altering phone call. He repeatedly reiterated that he could make life-altering phone calls. Spence said that his security force consisted of an off-duty Secret Service agents. The man who ushered me into Spence's office stood just outside the office door. When Spence called for him, he quickly skipped into the room. After Spence told him to show me his credentials, he whipped out a Secret Service badge and credentials, which I scrutinized. Spence then gestured for him to leave the office, and he followed Spence's order like a trained poodle. After Spence concluded expounding on his power and connections, he discussed my role in his grand vision. He made it clear that my escorts were interacting with the most powerful men in the country, so the caliber of escort was imperative to him. He required the highest quality escorts who were punctual and impeccably dressed. He required escorts who were articulate and appeared to be college graduates. He required that I diligently screen and qualify escorts to meet his lofty standards. Spence barked out his demands if he were barking orders in a Marine boot camp, and he emphasized that it was a privilege for me to provide him with escorts. Spence struck me as extremely smart and also very manipulative. He was a morass of arrogance and extreme narcissism that I had never encountered before. He indeed believed that he resided at the center of the universe, and I was merely a pawn in his grandiose game of chess. Spence certainly didn't impart a warm and fuzzy feeling during our initial meeting. In Shakespeare's King Lear, Gloucester and Edgar have a dialogue, and Edgar declares that the Prince of Darkness is a gentleman. As I departed Spence's house that day, I felt I had just met the Prince of Darkness. Spence continued to phone me almost every day, and about a month after our initial meeting, he began to summon me to his home. I was met at the door by one of his security personnel, which escorted me into the living room, was beautifully furnished and decorated. The living room had a glossy hardwood floor that was adorned with exquisite oriental rugs, and its walls were garnished with high-priced neoclassical paintings. His living room had towering bookshelves. Spence, an African-American man in his 40s, were reclined on the living room's chocolate-covered sofa, and I was directed to a leather chair that was adjacent to the sofa. Spence was casually dressed in designer jeans and a pink polo shirt. And after I sat down, he introduced me to Larry King, who was Lawrence E. King, his African-American friend. King was rather obese, and he wore a resplendent navy blue suit that I thought was either Armani or Brioni. He had meticulously coiffed, straight black hair and a trim goatee. His large frame designer glasses had tinted lenses that were partially obstructed his beady, darting eyes. A thick gold chain draped his neck, and he had a bulky gold ring that was encrusted by diamonds. King excluded a pomp and flashiness that even surpassed that of Spence. Spence gave me a chilly reception as King looked on with a sinister smile. Spence then started our meeting by excoriating me, because one of my escorts had belatedly arrived at his home. I explained to him that I had taken a 3-day vacation, and I wasn't able to tend the phone with my customary alacrity. Spence snapped that if he thought I needed a vacation, he would send me on a vacation. As Spence excoriated me, he was hunched over a china bowl in the living room's large circular crystal coffee table. The china bowl was brimming with cocaine, and he was dipping a gold Coke spoon into it. Spence eventually offered me a toot of Coke, but I declined. After Spence had taken 2 or 3 toots of Coke, he started to chatter about his exalted status and clout. Specks of cocaine littered his mustache. King also chimed in about his exalted status and clout as well. Or 2. I found like Spence was putting on a show for King, but King was an individual who acquiesced to being outboasted. They pumped themselves up like cartoonish parade balloons that were on the brink of bursting. Although I found their boast to be almost comedic, I refrained from laughing. King then made a number of disclosures that I found to be absolutely bizarre. He revealed that he had Spence operated an interstate pedophile network that flew children from coast to coast. King also discussed that he and Spence had a clientele of powerful pedophiles who actually took pleasure in murdering children. In fact, King seemed to be obsessed with the subject of murdering children. I sincerely thought that I was talking to a pair of psychotics on the run from a psychiatric hospital. After Spence and King conversed about their rarefied statuses and their extreme pedophilic perversities, Spence shifted gears and started to sincerely inquire about my life. He asked where I was born, where I attended college. He then questioned me about the particulars of my escort service. In the context of earlier discussion, Spence's questions seemed like non sequiturs to me. Though I answered Spence's questions truthfully, I was uncertain about his motivation for his inquiries, because Spence struck me as an individual who generally had a self-centered, utilitarian reason for every action. I also found it nearly impossible to believe that Spence's seismic narcissism made him constitutionally capable of taking a sincere interest in me. I thought that he either had a duplicitous reason for plying me with seemingly heartfelt questions, or I was witnessing a miracle tantamount to the parting of the Red Sea. As Spence inquired about my life, King sipped his drink and was ominously silent, but a nerving smile was etched on his face. When Spence finished quizzing me about my life, he stood up and gestured for me to accompany him. I stood up and followed him. Lawrence E. King remained seated on the sofa. Spence walked towards a large mirror that was situated on the living room wall and opened a closet door. This was in the corner of his living room. He popped open a secret panel that was embedded in his closet, and he stepped into a small room that was behind the mirror. I consciously paused at the threshold of the closet, but Spence waved his right hand, signifying that I should follow him into the surreptitious room. The mirror on the living room wall was in fact a two-way mirror, and the room had a video camera on a tripod that was pointed towards the living room and also a wall of video monitors. Spence leaned over one of the video monitors, and after tapping a few buttons, he replayed the concluding minutes of our conversation. At the moment, I felt shrink-wrapped by cellophane, and I found it difficult to breathe. As I silently stared at the monitor, Spence casually smiled and explained to me that his entire home was bugged for clandestine surveillance and CIA operatives, and installed the concealed video cameras throughout his house. He couldn't help himself from crowing that his surveillance equipment was state-of-the-art, and the camera had captured our conversations was embedded in the living room's thermostat. Spence then divulged that he blackmailed the rich and powerful. I remained stunned and speechless as I watched myself discussing my life and escort service on the video monitor, but after a few minutes I started to swell with anger. However, I didn't express my anger to Spence, because at that moment I was undeniably frightened of him, and I'm not a confrontational person. When Spence had flaunted his blackmail equipment, he dispensed a grave threat about the consequences. If I uttered nary a word relating to his concealed cameras, he then dismissed me. I walked out of his house in a state of shock. My mouth was parched and an adrenal chill coursed through my body. A montage of video footage of me discussing my life relentlessly overwhelmed my thoughts as I drove home that night. I was also utterly dumbfounded by King's disclosures, too. I have to confess that I was in a state of denial about King's revelations, because they were so bizarre. I found it hard to believe that people could be such unequivocal monsters. But Spence had videotaped me discussing the particulars of my life and my escort service, so now I was susceptible to blackmail. I no longer viewed Spence as a mere client. I felt he controlled me. Indeed, he started to tell escorts I sent his home that I worked for him. The escort service had started out as a carefree venture that was enjoyable and exciting, but Spence had imbued it with this sinister gravitas. Okay, so I guess I set everything up. Craig J. Spence was and Lawrence C. King were working together. This was a further branch of the Franklin scandal that went to the highest levels of the Reagan government and also involvement of George H.W. Bush. This was an aside to that. The Brownstone operation, which you see here, is very similar to what was reported to be occurring at Jeffrey Epstein's house at the Lex Wexner mansion. I was supposedly given to Epstein for $1. This very, recording and orgies and blackmail and underage and Lord knows what, snuff films, whatever you can imagine, was going on. So this also happened in Spence's house, just like it happened in Epstein's, Lex Wexner's estate. Spence was probably higher up than Lawrence C. King, in my opinion. I look at Spence more of like Lex Wexner. However, again, Spence would later be assassinated, and we'll get to that, murdered. And Lawrence C. King would go to jail, but not for, interstate child trafficking or murder or anything like that. He would go to prison for embezzlement of funds of the Franklin Credit Union, Community Credit Union, that he was managing. So, and he would later be released from prison, and he's been released from prison ever since. So it's very interesting, but now we have more information. Okay, so when people were attending Spence's parties, they were attending parties at his house, and what was happening at his house? Acts of extreme debauchery, homosexual acts, massive orgies, pedophile acts, children being abused and raped, maybe children even being murdered. So yeah, the worst of the worst was occurring at his house. So let's go to the article that broke the story of Craig J. Spence and Harry Vincent, which was reported by the Washington Times, which, yes, was Mooney and Sikh Council for National Policy controlled. However, I do believe that Paul M. Rodriguez was a genuine reporter, an investigative journalist, and that after he reported on the finders, he reported on Franklin, he reported on Craig J. Spence. His career was later sidelined, very much like Gary Webb in reporting for the Mercury News and his book, The Dark Alliance. And so Rodriguez, even though he was writing these really, really, true investigative journalism, at least I hope so, even though he's working for the Washington Times, articles, he would later, go into obscurity, be pushed to write for like magazines and stuff like that. Not really making a lot of money. So let's begin. Homosexual prostitution inquiry ensnares VIPs with Reagan. Bush callboys took midnight tour of White House. A homosexual prostitution ring is under investigation by federal and district authorities and includes among its clients key officials of Reagan and Bush's administrations, military officers, congressional aides, and U.S. and foreign businessmen with close social ties to Washington's political elite, documents obtained by the Washington Times reveal. One of the ring's high-profile clients was so well-connected, in fact, that he could arrange a middle-of-the-night tour of the White House for his friends on Sunday, July 3rd of last year. Among the 6 persons on the extraordinary 1 a.m. tour were 2 male prostitutes. Federal authorities, including the Secret Service, are investigating criminal aspects of the ring and have told male prostitutes and their homosexual clients. Their grand jury will deliberate over the evidence throughout the summer, the Times has learned. Reporters for the newspaper examined hundreds of credit card vouchers drawn on both corporate and personal cards and made payable to the escort service operated by the homosexual ring. Many of the vouchers were run through a so-called submerchant account of the Chambers Funeral Home by a son of the owner without the company's knowledge. So they're talking about the ring that Harry Vincent was involved in was the one that got busted, that was around Craig J. Spence and around the Lawrence C. King. So it was part of the Franklin scandal. The Confessions of D.C. Madam, Harry Vincent, who we just read from, it was his ring or his part of the ring that was busted, that was part of, he's working under Spence. Now, Vincent claims that he never hired anybody under the age of 18. And I like Harry. I like his book. Or not Harry, Henry. I like his book. I liked the interviews that he did with Ed Offerman. There are some red flags. Him going to Narconon and being taught the ways of Scientology. However, later, very interesting, the lawyer that would represent him and would later stab him in the back, and Henry Vincent would spend many years in prison, is Scientologist and Fox News, Scientologist lawyer and Fox News anchor Greta Van Susteren. So I don't think Henry Vincent is a Scientologist, even though he was taught in the ways and went clear and through Narconon, but it's still interesting. I hope to one day interview Henry Vincent. But he was around this nexus, even though he claims that there were no under the age of 18 male escorts, that he provided to this nexus. And I somewhat believe Henry in that. He wasn't brought upon charges for any of that. When you read the newspaper clippings, it doesn't really... It appears that the escorts were, at least that he was providing, were of age. And so, yeah, I mean, it's possible, maybe not. And it's also curious about him going to Narconon and being taught in the ways of L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology and going clear, and then being discharged from Narconon. But I don't know. I'd love to interview Mr. Vincent if he would come on. Okay. Among the clients contained in the vouchers and identified by prostitutes and escort operators and government officials, locally based United States military officers, businessmen, lawyers, bankers, congressional aides, and other professionals. Editors of the Times and the newspaper would print only the names of those found to be in sensitive government posts or positions of influence. There is no intention of publishing names or facts about the operation merely for titillation, said Wesley Pruden, manager editor of the Times. The Office of United States Attorney General J.B. Stevens, former deputy White House counsel to President Reagan, is coordinating federal aspects of the inquiry, but refused to discuss the investigation or grand jury actions. Several former White House colleagues of Mr. Stevens are listed among clients of the homosexual prostitution ring, according to the credit card records. And those persons who have confirmed the charges were theirs. Mr. Stevens' office, after first saying it would cooperate with the Times inquiry, withdrew the offer late yesterday, and also declined to say whether Mr. Stevens would recluse himself from the case because of possible conflict of interest. At least one highly placed Bush administration official and wealthy businessman who procured homosexual prostitutes from the escort services operated by the ring are cooperating with the investigation, several sources said. Among clients who charged homosexual prostitutes serving on major credit cards over the past 18 months are Charles K. Dutcher, former Associate Director of Presidential Personnel in the Reagan administration, and Paul R. Balk, Library Secretary Elizabeth Dole's political personal liaison to the White House. In the 1970s, Mr. Dutcher was a congressional aide to former Robert Bauman, Maryland Republican, who resigned from the House after admitting having engaged in sexual liaisons with teenage male prostitutes. Mr. Dutcher, who had worked on the staff of Vice President Dan Quayle when he represented an Indiana district in the House. A charge was also discovered against the credit card of a former White House staffer who prepared the president's daily news summary in the Reagan administration. Todd A. Blodgett said he had not made the charge. One of the ring's big spending clients is Craig J. Spence, Washington socialite, international trade consultant. According to the documents and interviews with operators and prostitutes, said they engaged in sexual activities with Mr. Spence. Mr. Spence spent upwards of $20,000 a month for male prostitutes who provide sex to him and his friends, and to include military personnel who acted as bodyguards. It was Mr. Spence who arranged a nocturnal tour of Reagan's White House. Repeated attempts to reach Mr. Spence by telephone, fax machine, and personal visits to his home were unsuccessful. But guys, I thought Council for National Policy member Ronald Wilson Reagan and George H.W. Bush were stand-up guys and really good Christians, especially Ronald Wilson Reagan. They would never be involved in something like this, right? Credit card vouchers confirmed that Mr. Spence charged thousands of dollars on American Express and Visa cards, sometimes making $600 charges against his cards several times a day, drawn on behalf of an escort service called Professional Services Incorporated. Members of major news organizations also procured escort services from the Ring credit card documents show. They include Stanley Mark Tapscott, who is assisting managing editor of the Washington Times. Oh boy. Mr. Tapscott, whose resignation on June 20 was accepted, said he had not procured homosexual escorts or sexual services of any kind. He said in the interview he had talked to two women he arranged to meet through the escort service as part of the investigation of adult porn services he initiated. Just like Kurt Eichenwald. It was an investigation, all it was, guys. I'm serious. I was just investigating. He said in an interview that he had talked to two women and arranged to meet through escort service as part of the investigation of a down porn service he initiated a year earlier when he was editor of the newspaper's money section. What does it have to do with money? The charges were made against his company, American Express card. His editors knew of no such investigation. But before joining the Times, Mr. Tapscott worked for the Office of Personnel Management in the Reagan administration. Managers of the escort ring said that a few women were used for clients who called for specific requests, but the regular stable was altogether male. A document showed that a number of clients, lawyers, doctors, and business executives used corporate credit cards to procure escort services, and that a number of military officers from the United States and allied countries, including one former officer using a Department of Defense credit card, charged male escort services. One former top-level Pentagon officer said that for the past 8 years, military and civilian intelligence authorities have been concerned that a nest of homosexuals at the top of the Reagan administration may have been penetrated by Soviet-backed espionage agents poisoning as male prostitutes, said one former top-level Pentagon official. So who would also be saying the same thing? Now, I'm not going to say that that isn't true, that there wasn't any KGB involvement in this. However, there's some CIA involvement and some CMP involvement in this too, and that's what they ain't going to talk about. We have known for many, many years that there's a department of KGB Soviet intelligence whose job is to prey on sexual deviants, said retired Lieutenant General Daniel O. Graham, former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Well, Daniel, Major Council for National Policy member, didn't you also work for Craig J. Spence too? When they were doing research for the Japanese? So you're not going to blame the CIA's involvement in this. You're only going to show the KGB side of things. And you're not going to talk about the Council for National Policy involvement in this either because you're a part of it. Oh, Daniel, I think you were really, really deep in a lot of this stuff. Because closet homosexuals in government services can easily be turned through blackmail for espionage purposes, General Graham said. We have always had intelligence try very hard not to be giving classified information to known homosexuals. Then why were you so friendly with Spence? It was very obvious that Spence was a homosexual, Graham. So why did you work with him for foreign intelligence reports and media reports with the Japanese government? If you were so worried about giving classified information to homosexuals, then why would you work for him? It's crap. Those interviewed by the Times confirmed that there were blackmail attempts by male prostitutes who wanted money and other favors to protect clients' sexual lives. The clients interviewed say a February 28th police raid on a house at 6004 34th Place Northwest was set off by reports of blackmail and possible credit card fraud complaints, and by district hotel operators about prostitution activities. In the raid spearheaded by Washington Field Office of the United States Secret Service, authorities found a telephone switchboard operation serving a half-dozen homosexual escort services. Secret Service agents and district police Vice investigators confiscated financial records as well as ledgers, photos, diaries, telephone records, Rolodexes, and client lists of the prostitution network during the raid, with the subsequent subpoenas issued by the D.C. Superior Court. And those were never seen from again. Now, of course, Secret Service agents would have been there. Why do you might ask? Now, some people will say, well, John, it's because it involves the President of the United States and the Vice President. Yeah, I understand that. But weren't they also running security for this operation too? I call that a cleanup crew. Just me. Just me. Although the confiscating material was turned over to the district police on the scene, witness and law enforcement agents said the Secret Service kept one box containing names and other information about high-level government officials who were clients of the mail escort business. Of course they did. District police officials say to their knowledge that this is the first time the Secret Service has ever become involved in such a raid in this area. Initially, the Secret Service denied that it was involved in the raid, but after the second raid of the 34th Police House on May 18th, the agency acknowledged its involvement in the investigation. Secret Service spokesman Bob Snow said the agency participated in the search and seizure operation because of its jurisdiction over credit card fraud. We came into such operations usually at the request of the U.S. Attorney. If the fraud involves $10,000 or more, we are not involved in any local prostitution investigation, said Mr. Snow. Witness to the February raid said 12 Secret Service agents in blue parkas entered the house and spent several hours collecting and removing boxes of files. Federal and district investigators have since interrogated several prostitutes working for the ring, as well as clients of homosexual escort services operating under such names as Jovian, Man to Man, Metrodate, Ultimate Models, and Ultimate First Class. In addition to credit card fraud, the investigation is said to be focused on illegal interstate prostitution, abduction, and use of minors for sexual perversion, extortion, larceny, and related illicit drug trafficking, and used by prostitutes and their clients. So you're telling me everything that I've said has been part of this network, among others like George from CavDev.org, that the whole nexus of the Council for National Policy there in the 1980s with the Franklin scandal with Iran-Contra, it was all a network of child trafficking, human trafficking, well, I guess adult trafficking in that regard, that's what I meant to say, drug trafficking, and gun running. Imagine that. This all connects together in a nexus that was going on, and is still going on, and the players have just changed as they always change. Witness to the February raid said 12 Secret Service agents in blue parkers entered the house and spent several hours collecting and removing boxes of files. How I read that. One of the chief operators of Professional Services, Inc., and a regular client of the service speculated in separate interviews that the investigation would be restrictive because big names were involved. Henry Vincent, the operator, said a high-level official is going to try to block the investigation and may succeed, said Mr. Bollock, the Labor Secretary liaison to the White House. Mr. Vincent said he believes a highly placed federal official whom he would not name is working to derail the investigation, but he would not elaborate. We're going to get to who that is in a minute. Authorities have been investigating possible credit card fraud by the ring operator since last fall. Operators of the ring told the Times that videotapes, audio tapes, and still photographs were made of sex acts performed by clients, and the call boys included perverted acts. Documents show that customers were charged for videotapes from the operation. All right. Second agent eyed in prostitution investigation. July 19th, 1989. As authorities expanded a prostitution investigation ring with raids outside Washington last week, continued heavy scrutiny of one of the ring's prominent clients has placed a second Secret Service officer under suspicion. Meanwhile, law enforcement officials were looking into the possible presence of children, and the means hold against them against their will in the Northwest Washington house that served as a ring nerve center. And the finders were very close to that Colorado neighborhood too, and people have always suspected, including myself. Is this all just one giant ring that the players may shift, but it still goes on, once, because you can't keep it operating forever. Eventually someone's going to find out. So they just, it's like shift, it's like not shift, matter of shift, but like shuffle, like they shuffle the players. Okay, this one gets shut down, but this one's still going, and it goes on, infinitum, and sick, twisted hold that Satan has over these people and driving of just evil intentions, So it's just kind of like, so this network's got shut down. Now we have. Franklin and the Finders have got shut down, even though they're part of a very similar network that may have been working together. So now we have Epstein. Epstein replaces it. And it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Epstein. After Epstein, you have Nexium. So, yeah. There are latest turns in a case marked from the beginning by bizarre twists. As the investigation progressed under the direction of the U.S. Attorney and the Secret Service, we have placed newly obtained evidence under court seal. Suspense continued here that a large amount of evidence, which was taken from the House earlier in the investigation and fell into the hands of the news media, could reach further into the Washington hierarchy. There was, however, no clear sign that this would happen. Yeah, of course. Agents from the Secret Service searched 2 dwellings in West Virginia Tuesday, belonging to relatives of Henry W. Vinson, one-time mortician and alleged operator of the sophisticated alcohol service with homosexual and heterosexual clients, seizing various papers and telephone records from the home of Sister Brenda Copley in Fort Gay, West Virginia. Okay, so the funeral service wasn't in Midwest. I don't know why I thought it was. The funeral home that he owned or operated was in West Virginia. I apologize for that mistake. I retract saying it was in the Midwest. According to the officials and the sister, the raids appear to stem from evidence turned up since the prostitution ring's headquarters was first raided in February that pointed to the businesses in West Virginia, which Vincent's mother, Joyce B. Vincent, had one time had an interest. A dwelling searched in Williamson, West Virginia, said by law enforcement official that to be Joyce Vincent's home was found to be vacant. Copley said that neither her mother nor her brother was in town, and examining the prostitution ring with cooperation of at least one employee, James Travis Smith, the Secret Service is focusing primarily on various forms of credit card fraud, including false application for credit cards used in obtaining hotel rooms, and fraudulent use of a merchant account through false description of services provided. Okay, this one was in August. I'm going to try to keep the timeline here. Okay, it's around the same time. Spence, arrested in New York, released. Once host to Powerful, reduced to begging, sleeping in park. Michael Hedges and Jerry Sepper, The Washington Times. Craig J. Spence, the once powerful Washington lobbyist under scrutiny by the Secret Service for late-night White House tours and theft from the presidential mansion, was arrested here last week for carrying a loaded gun and crack cocaine. Mr. Spence, who spent recent weeks prowling the city's finest hotels, cutting deals with inmates to protect himself in jail and eventually sleeping on a bench in Central Park, faces up to 8 years in prison. Monday, in a tense 8-hour interview with the Washington Times in a friend's apartment where reporters had tracked him, Mr. Spence said that the discovery in 1986 that he had aged triggered his descent into using callboys and crack. Yeah, okay. In a conversation that plumbed the depths of morbidity and self-pity, Mr. Spence caressed a shiny double-edged razor blade he said he would ultimately use to kill himself and alluded frequently to his impending suicide and move he said he would take before AIDS debilitates him. I don't believe that. I think that right there is added in. I don't trust Michael Hedges and Jerry Sepper like I do Paul Rodriguez. I think that was them adding that, the Mooney, CMP, you add this in. All right, I could be wrong, but no. Asked how he thought he would remember Washington, he quoted Carl Sandburg. Does it matter, the dust and the cool tombs? Mr. Spence said he had left Wednesday early in July after becoming aware through news accounts of the Secret Service investigation. He spent several nights in expensive hotels in New York, rapidly spending his diminishing funds according to hotel records in his account. He was arrested July 31st at the Barbizon Hotel on East 63rd Street in Manhattan. According to police records, police took Mr. Spence into custody after a disturbance there. A loaded 9mm pistol was seized along with a small amount of crack. He spent parts of the next 3 days in jail before being released on personal recognizance. August 2nd, he faced another hearing. August 28th, maximum sentences for the charges against him total 8 years in prison. Mr. Spence's account of the episode considerably colored the drab prose of police reports. He said he set up a meeting with a call boy who arrived with drugs. When the male escort attempted to steal $10,000 in cash and traveler's checks from his room, according to Mr. Spence in police reports, Mr. Spence started the ruckus that led to the arrest. They put me in the Tombs, slang from the New York jail, for 3 days without a phone call, Mr. Spence said. I survived by offering to be a valet to the biggest thug there, a man appropriately named Heavy, and giving him half my bologna sandwich. I had to teach him not to pronounce it valet, like some parking attendant. Mr. Spence, who is central to an investigation to the theft of Truman administration's China from the White House. So it's interesting they stole the Truman administration China, the cowboys did. And a male cowboy ring raided in February by... I'm sorry. Sometimes it's the absurdity of this stuff. By D.C. police and federal agents has eluded Secret Service agents and reporters since his dealing was first reported by the Times on June 29th. Mr. Spence, 48, who had been sought by Secret Service to testify early next week before a grand jury and paneled by U.S. Attorney Jay Stevens, said late-night tours could have not been set up by a uniformed Secret Service officer, Reginald D. Gildray. Officer D. Gildray and another officer were suspended without pay last week as a result of ongoing White House investigation. Reggie couldn't have arranged anything, Mr. Spence said. Poor Reggie, he's a nice guy. I gave him a Rolex watch unsolicited, and he later gave me this little dish, as Rosalind Carter would say out of the Truman China. I didn't ask for it. Reggie, like an elevator operator pushing the buttons, but he is not the guy who cleared it for you to get in the elevator. Mr. Spence hinted the tours were arranged by top-level officials, including Donald Gregg, National Security Advisor to Vice President Bush, and now Ambassador Designate to South Korea. Who was it who got Felix Rodriguez, the CIA former Costa Rica station chief who became embroiled in the Iran-Contra affair, in to see Bush? Mr. Spence asked when pressed to say who got him inside the White House. He agreed he was alluding to Mr. Gregg. I guess it all connects, huh? Iran-Contra, Franklin. Mr. Gregg yesterday dismissed the allegation as absolute bull. Vacation in Delaware, Mr. Gregg said the only time he met Mr. Spence at an April party, the lobbyist arranged for former South Korean Prime Minister Nam Duk-woo. He found him to be a thoroughly unpleasant character. It disturbs me that I could touch a slimy hand out of the sewer to grab me by the ankle like this, Mr. Gregg said. The allegations are totally false. Mr. Spence said all the parties he held at his Colorado home were bugged by friendly intelligence agents. He described in detail how he rigged his apartment with listening devices, electrical outlets, and the walls after he was approached by an intelligence agency he refused to identify. They basically just wanted to be sure nothing was being said that shouldn't be said, he said. He boasted that he created important Japanese politicians, conducted covert operations for Central American governments, and traveled in a circle of high-ranking closet homosexuals in Washington. He said he would not identify homosexuals in the Bush administration. I'm not going to smear the Republican Party, he said. You're not going to smear the CMP either, are you? Mr. Spence described other midnight White House tours, including one he arranged for a group of powerful Japanese businessmen, who he said photographed themselves in the Oval Office. He alluded frequently to the even deeper mysteries. All this stuff you're going to uncover, to be honest with you, is insignificant compared to other things I've done. But I'm not going to tell you those things, and somehow the world will carry on without knowing, he said. After he became aware of the Secret Service interest in his activities, Mr. Spence said he destroyed audio tapes and hundreds of photographs, mainly obtained surreptitiously during his parties. By the time the Secret Service raided his apartment, he said that all was left behind was his AZT, anti-AIDS medication. Secret Service confirmed the agency searched a search warrant at Massachusetts Avenue apartment, and the agents did in fact find vials of AZT. Careening from the wit that had won him powerful friends to glum resignation that my life is over, Mr. Spence reserved his deepest bitterness for former acquaintances, who he said have now forsaken him. I had the world at my house, and now they don't know who I am, he said. But they didn't come, did they? Mr. Spence said he had frequently used callboy services, and that he liked handsome, young, blonde, 19-year-old boys. Bless me. But he said he'd not spent $20,000 a month for them. As reflected in credit card documents obtained by the Times, These charges were inflated illegally by one escort service manager, he said. He declined to elaborate, but said he fired his accountant over the matter, although he never turned over to authorities. During his hour as a Washington host, Mr. Spence dressed in Edwardian finery and lived extravagantly, affecting touches such as a scarlet-lined capes and stretch limousines. Among those who frequented his parties were journalists Eric Severeid, Ted Koppel, William Safire, former CI Director William Casey, the late John Mitchell, Attorney General in the Nixon administration, conservative activists, and America's grandmother and Council for National Policy founding member, Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly. America's grandma. Christian ideals and values and anti-abortion and anti-equal rights amendment. She puts on this good, I'm a conservative grandma. Everybody loves me. But yet she was going to these parties where these horrible atrocities were occurring. And the right ain't going to tell you that. They're not, because they're not going to be honest. They're not going to be honest. The ambassador to Korea, now to China, James Lilly, and General Alfred M. Gray, Commandant of the Marine Corps. Arnaud de Borchgrave, editor-in-chief of the Times, said he went to dinner once at Mr. Spence's home to honor Mr. Lilly. Of course. Even in recent months, Mr. Spence insisted he retain enough cachet to set up large business negotiations, such as one between the Washington law firm of Bishop, Cook, Purcell, and Reynolds, represented by former United States Attorney Joseph DeGenova, and a major computer manufacturer, Compaq. He said influential persons such as Mr. DeGenova, although aware of his increasing use of drugs, courted him for his network of business connections. Mr. DeGenova was in Hawaii yesterday and could not be reached for comment. As a secretary told the nature of the inquiry, she said she could not divulge Mr. DeGenova's vacation telephone number. In early interviews, the former federal prosecutor said he went to Japan with Mr. Spence and Mr. Bishop in 1988 on business. Mr. DeGenova was in... Okay. When I got back from Japan, some anonymous person suggested that Mr. Spence might be using cocaine. Well, of course, my antennae went right up and I checked those rumors out and found much to my surprise that people suspected the worst, Mr. DeGenova said. At that point, Mr. DeGenova said he severed his relationship with Mr. Spence. When you compared it to his other eccentric behavior, it made sense, but I had no evidence whatsoever, he said. Mr. DeGenova said he never took his concern that Mr. Spence might be using drugs to authorities and said he never witnessed cocaine used by Mr. Spence or others at the parties. Of course. A spokeswoman for Compaq, which is based in Houston, said yesterday that the firm had no record of any contact with Mr. Spence. She said, however, there had been dealings with Mr. Bishop's law firm, and she declined to say what they were. By Monday, Mr. Spence's flash had been reported by the grim residue of his recent 3-day stay in a New York jail, and a fitful night on a Central Park bench, during which he said muggers had lifted the last few dollars he borrowed from a friend. Located by reporters as a stylish apartment of a friend near Central Park, Mr. Spence first resisted the relish describing his career. After initial jobs in Massachusetts politics and a correspondent for ABC News in Vietnam, Mr. Spence began focusing on Far Eastern affairs, he said. Mr. Spence said his genius was recognizing before other U.S. observers that Japan was headed for economic greatness, and in being able to identify to help Japanese Diet members on the way up. I became a very significant intellectual force in Japan, he said, with typical braggadocio. I created 3 members of the Japanese Diet, as called percepti. I saw a future prime minister and an obscure little man named Yoshihiro Nakasone, when all our spastics here didn't say that. Mr. Spence claimed that he coached Mr. Nakasone on dealing with the United States, advising him to buy President Reagan a saddle for a president rather than golf clubs, and always to mention a former president's movies just before the press was admitted for photo opportunities, to ensure the two would be engaged in an animated conversation. Among his achievements, Mr. Spence said he was producing a brilliant position paper that persuaded the Japanese to allow the Palestinian Liberation Organization to open an office in Tokyo. Oh, interesting. So he wasn't a Zionist. He also said he greatly enhanced the reputation of Mutu Shina, a powerful member of the Daesh Japan's parliament who is considered Japan's top expert on defense issues and a likely future prime minister. Mutu's father, Etesaburo, was a great man who asked me to help his son, who he saw as a playboy, Mr. Spence said. I made Mutu Shia in the United States, then he sued me. The lawsuit over a home on Wyoming Avenue Northwest in a fashionable neighborhood of homes of senior diplomats began when Mr. Shima sought the return of $345,000 he lent to Mr. Spence because the property eventually the suit would be dropped on the day Mr. Sheena was to give sworn deposition. The settlement terms led to Mr. Spence's company getting $68,000 from the Policy Studies Group headed by Mr. Sheena. Mr. Spence agreed to repay Mr. Sheena $379,000 at 5% interest. The money was repaid when Mr. Spence sold the house for $900,000 and he kept approximately $500,000 of profit. Mr. Spence said yesterday he had forced Mr. Sheena's attorney to drop the suit by threatening to reveal the money was hot. The money came into the country illegally from Hong Kong, and I knew it, he said. That's why I could be sarcastic in my deposition. I knew they wouldn't push it. Mr. Sheena has denied any wrongdoing in the case. He has specifically denied any violations of currency exchange laws. Mr. Spence said he later turned up his lobbying clients to China with the intention of establishing high-level influence there. They have no money. What were they going to pay me with? Rice, he asked. I did it to make contacts. Throughout this period, Mr. Spence admitted to leading a dual-level existence with separate but strong excitements. On the surface, he threw dazzling parties and waiting seminars and staring Washington celebrities. A profile of Mr. Spence in the New York Times in January 1982 was headlined, "Have Names Will Open Right Doors." The article quoted in a Washington Post column as saying of Mr. Spence in 1980s, and we already read that quote. Alright, nothing really more interesting. From the Spokane Chronicle, this is actually from the Associated Press. August 9th, 1989. Spence faces New York charges in drug probe. Craig Spence, a flamboyant lobbyist who's been a headline figure in the federal investigation of the Washington cowboy ring, is facing cocaine and gun possession charges in New York City, it was reported today. Spence, 48, was arrested July 31st along with a male prostitute at a Manhattan hotel. The Washington Times and Washington Post reported. Let's see if there's anything else that wasn't in the other report that we read. New York police officer Lori Pollock told the Washington Post that she arrived at Spence's room in the Barbizon Hotel she heard crashing. This guy, Craig Spence, comes running out of the room screaming that the other guy has a gun. Pollock was quoted as saying, "We got the gun and it wasn't loaded. We determined that it belonged to Spence. There were drugs in the room, also cocaine and a crack pipe." I'm just trying to see if there's anything else in this article that we haven't read. Nope. Okay. Alright, let's spell it. Craig's funeral. He found murdered. Okay, let's read a little bit more from Confessions of a D.C. Madam by Henry Vincent. No. Kindle. Kindle's stuck down there. There it goes. Okay. All right, let's look up Casey. There we go. I felt potential risk to my life was CIA Director William Casey's patronage of my escort service. The Washington Times reported that William Casey attended parties at Spence's house and Casey and Spence were friends, but his reporters were unaware of their relationship had a common denominator that entailed procuring gay escorts from me. William Casey started to phone me for gay escorts in 1986. Like Barney Frank, his preferred escort was an 18-year-old with minimal body hair and a slender swimmer's physique. Although he requested I provided him with underage escorts, I told him that I wouldn't acquiescence to that request. Casey met with the escorts at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel when it was near DuPont Circle. After he was nude and splayed on the bed, he had escorts rub oil all over his body. Ugh. And as he kissed them and fondled them. Casey was old and withered, and the escorts didn't particularly savor their encounters with him. Casey came to the attention because he wasn't able to have an erection, and the escorts that I employed were perplexed by his elaborate rituals with the oil and his erectile dysfunction. Casey died of cancer in May of 1987, so when the Washington Times started to break stories about Spence and my escort service, Casey had drifted to hereafter. Nevertheless, I was worried that his CIA cronies would bury his secret dalliances with young men, even if that involved burying me. Okay. There's one more. S. Scott Fitzgerald, Jeff Gannon. Yeah, what was about Jeff Gannon on here? Oh, no, okay, never mind. I'm telling the story about Jeff Gannon, not Jeff Gannon, Henry Vincent knowing Jeff Gannon. It's been a while since I've read this book. It's been years at this point. I need to go back and reread it, actually. I'm just looking through the names. If there's anybody here that I want to read. Donald Gregg. L. Ron Hubbard. That's just when Henry Vincent went to Narconon. Mentions Frank Murkowski. Was Roy Cohn mentioned? Can't remember. I'll search for Roy Cohn in a minute. Does anybody in the chat know who was the second Attorney General in the Reagan administration? Does anybody know who that was in the chat? I think his name was in the back of this book. That's right, Henry Vincent doesn't name him. Okay, so Henry Vincent, and I have to find the exact page, but it's not showing up. Henry Vincent had Dick Thornburg. I remember before I looked it up. So Dick Thornburg was Attorney General. Barr was under Thornburg, and I think Thornburg was who covered up for the Franklin scandal. So Barr had to have known about it. Okay, I talked about it on the Opperman show. I talked about it when I discussed the life and crimes of William Barr. Thornburg threatened. Dick Thornburg threatened. Maybe. I want to make sure his name is right. I know Lee's saying in the chat Ed Meese. Ed Meese was the second. I mean the first. It was after Meese. I want to make sure I get this right. So you have Ed Meese. So you have... Oh, I've had so many attorney generals. Okay, so you have Ed Meese during Reagan. And you have Dick Thornburg after Meese. I was right. Okay. So, and Dick Thornburg was actually acting Attorney General too at the beginning of Jimmy Carter's administration. So you have Ed Meese, and then Ed Meese resigns. And then you have Dick Thornburg. I think Ed Meese resigned, if I remember. Edwin Meese was a big Council for National Policy member. But anyway, Edwin Meese was replaced by Dick Thornburgh, and William Barr was the assistant attorney general at that time under Dick Thornburgh. Harry Vincent talks about in this stream that Dick Thornburgh, he hints at it very strongly. Both me and George, I'm actually going to ask him if I get him on an interview. He hints that Thornburgh showed up and was like, "You're going to go down. We have you. You better cooperate," and that's it. So, and I'm paraphrasing. But it's pretty well known that me and George actually probably have talked about it before. So Barr was under Thornburgh. Barr had to have known. He had to have known about the Franklin scandal and about, Craig J. Spence and the ring that was going on and everything. There's no doubt about it in my mind he had to know. All right. But people like Amazing Polly want to tell you that William Barr, strong Christian faith and trust the plan. William Barr, the fixer, the deep state swamp dweller, one of the kings himself. As much as the Amazing Polly loves to call everyone else swamp dwellers except for Barr. Barr the fixer knew about the Franklin scandal and knew about Craig J. Spence because he was directly under Dick Thornburgh as the Assistant Attorney General and later becoming the Attorney General twice of these United States of America under George H.W. Bush and under Donald John Trump. All right. We're almost done. I know it's a long stream, but I had a lot to cover on Spence. Make sure this is before everything. Yep, okay. The Boston Sunday Globe, November 12th, 1989. Lobbyist in callboy investigation found dead in Boston hotel room. Craig J. Spence, the Washington lobbyist who last summer was at the center of the homosexual prostitution investigation and who took companions on surreptitious tours of the White House, committed suicide Friday in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, police sources said. Spence, 49, was reportedly fully clothed in a black tuxedo with a white bow tie, lying on his bed. There were no signs of injury. Police were called to the hotel at 3:39 p.m. Friday when the house cleaning staff could not open the door to room 429, which is the new wing of the posh hotel on Arlington Street. Spence had been scheduled to check out of the hotel that day. According to police, the door was barricaded with a king-size bed. To gain access to the room, the door had to be sawed in half. Jeez. Spence had checked into the Ritz on November 4th using the alias. Patricia Cutler, director of public relations for the hotel, declined to say what name Spence used. Spence was identified by personal papers, police said. The medical examiner's office is investigating the cause of death, and a formal autopsy report was not expected until today. In an August interview with the Washington Times, Spence said he discovered in 1986 he had AIDS. Friends said he talked about committing suicide. Spence was identified as a major client of the callboy service that went by the names Man to Man, Jacks, Jocks, and Dream Boys. Some reports had said the federal investigation of the service would reach into the upper levels of the Reagan and Bush administrations. Spence has been subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury, reportedly concerned with the callboy service, but it's unclear whether he was testified, said his friend Liz Trotta, a former national television correspondent. Trotta said she was called to testify recently. The Secret Service was interested in Spence because he was able to take friends and male prostitutes on unauthorized tours of the White House. A White House guard had admitted... Okay, I've already read that. I'm going to go to parts that I haven't read. Spence graduated from Boston University in 1968. He went to work in press office for then-Governor Endicott Peabody. When we first knew him, he was the most attractive man with bright ideas and a sense of humor, said Tony Peabody, the wife of the former governor. I thought he'd keep in touch with us. He was never a staff member, but more a member of the family. When Peabody was defeated in 1964, Spence went to work on the staff of then Massachusetts House Speaker John F. X. Devoren. In the mid-1960s, he went to Southeast Asia as a Vietnam War correspondent for ABC News. Spence lost his press credentials when he was caught cashing his paycheck on the black market. He spent much of the 1970s in Japan. He used connections he made there to be lobbyist for Japanese concerns when he returned to the United States and settled in Washington. In the capital, He held numerous parties and entertained guests such as Ted Koppel, Eric Severed, William Casey, and Arnaud de Borchgrave. The Peabody saw Spence twice in Washington and said he was a changed man. I was shocked at his manner. He was a real entrepreneur, a real con artist, and very much in with the Japanese when the Peabodys were dining one night at a restaurant with some Japanese officials. Spence showed up uninvited and pulled up a chair. It was unclear that brought Spence to Boston for the last week of his life. He grew up in upstate New York, but Spence liked to tell friends he came from Boston, said Trotta. Whatever the reasons, he was flamboyant to the end. He died wearing black shoes, black socks, a black tuxedo with white suspenders, and a white bow tie. Now, if I remember correctly, some people make the claim that Spence, just like Lawrence E. King, was a part of Operation Phoenix. I want to make note of that too. November 1989, Craig Spence is found dead. I want to read if there's any parts we didn't read. Mr. Spence had apparently barricaded the door of the bed. He was found fully clothed and there were no visible signs of injuries. Suffolk County Medical Examiner Leonard Atkins said Saturday an autopsy had been completed, but the cause of death was still under investigation. He said it could be weeks before his office issues a cause of death. I'm trying to read if there's anything new. Nope, that's all stuff that we know, that I've read. In death, Spence stayed true to form. Michael Hedges and Jerry Sepper, The Washington Times. Craig J. Spence, a once powerful lobbyist who had entertained and influenced Washington elite, died Friday. Much as he had lived dressed in a tuxedo in Boston's most expensive hotel, listening to Mozart with $3 in his pocket. Someone with Washington called the hotel that day and said Craig Spence had called the caller maybe 6, said a police detective. But the hotel couldn't find a Mr. Spence register. It turned out he had checked under the alias C.S. Kane. Friends theorized the alias was our ironic takeoff of Orson Welles' fictional hero Citizen Kane, who Mr. Spence once said he admired. Oh, that's interesting, too. There's no sign of foul play whatsoever. No Marstone's body, said Boston Police Detective Robert Harrington. It was as if he had fallen asleep talking on the telephone. The door of the hotel was to have been barricaded with the room's other double bed and chair, according to police report. Hotel maintenance workers who had to saw through the door to enter the room. The other way to get in the room was through the fourth-floor window facing a busy street. Mr. Spence may have attempted to save himself after taking an intentional overdose, according to police investigators. Wow, interesting. In an interview with the Washington Times in August, Mr. Spence made frequent allusions to his work with the CIA, a connection the CIA sources deny. But on the bed near him when he died, according to 2 Boston detectives who handled the investigation, was a newspaper clipping detailing efforts by CIA Director William Webster to initiate legislation giving protection to CIA agents called upon to testify before government bodies. He had boasted to reporters at the Times that if he testified, he would provide a wealth of damaging information, including the workings of the cowboy ring, bribery of Japanese and United States officials, and other assorted matters. But despite the subpoena, Mr. Spence apparently never appeared before the grand jury. During the past few weeks, Mr. Spence had told several friends the callboy operation was being investigated by the U.S. Attorney's Office and federal authorities as a possible CIA front. He told the friends that the CIA used the surface to compromise other federal intelligence officials and foreign diplomats. One friend quoted him as saying, "Casey's boys are out to get me." Apparent reference to former CIA Director William Casey, now deceased. Mr. Casey and Mr. Spence were friends, and the former CIA Director attended parties by the former lobbyist. He had arrived at the hotel on November 4th. Mr. Spence told a hotel worker that he had become friendly and was in town to meet his former boss. One time, Massachusetts Speaker of the House John DeVoren, police said. But the meeting never occurred, they said. During a lengthy interview at the Manhattan apartment in August, Mr. Spence frequently alluded to deep mysteries. Okay, we already read that. He also talked frequently about suicide, reporting my life is over. He reserved deep bitterness for high-powered friends who had forsaken him. All right. The Bombshell That Didn't Explode by Eleanor Randolph. August 1st, 1989. The Washington Post. The story about the key officials of the Reagan and Bush administration involved a cowboy ring. The Washington Times in late June seemed poised to give this town the one thing it adores, a summer scandal. But But as of last week, journalists have been left debating whether the Times published a blockbuster or blockbuster, as one critic put it. The story is intriguing, involving male prostitution, because this story was before Craig Spence killed himself, in quotation marks. The story is intriguing, involving male prostitution and a lobbyist who used parties to promote his business connections and business connections to promote his parties. But it is a government scandal or just a sordid slice of life in a city that happens to be Washington, D.C. Washington Times editor-in-chief Arnaud de Borchgrave, when asked whether the story is as big as his paper has advertised, said the scandals involving. Interesting, because Arnaud de Borchgrave had went to Craig B. Spence parties, but he was editor-in-chief in the Washington Times. So how much truth was the Mooney Council for National Policy controlled Washington Times? When I talk about the Moonies, I'm talking about the Unification Church ran by the Reverend Sung Myung Moon, who owned the Washington Times and also had connections to the Council for National Policy, and were adored by many members as the Messiah instead of Jesus Christ, and the abomination and heresy that is. So if the editor-in-chief, Arnaud de Borchgrave, was good friends with Craig B. Spence, how much truth? How much truth? Now, I would say Paul Rodriguez probably did the best he can, but what about anybody else? The story is going to be much like Watergate, de Borchgrave said. It will go on for months. He reminds me a lot of Harold Anderson, being involved in the Franklin scandal and covering it up for the Omaha World Herald. They're almost, it's almost like identical. The story is going to be, it will go on for months. Each time you shake a tree, something else falls out of it. Numerous Washingtonians in recent weeks have said that Times exclusives, many of which them have not been reprinted in other papers, are worthy of more effort from thousands of reporters who work in Washington. We can get a little too stuffy, said Stephen Hess, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. In some way, that's a classic story. It's just that the press has become so professional that we have a class structure built in now. We look our noses down at yellow journalism. All right, let's see here. I'm trying to see if there's anything else. They talk about the raid, Harry Vincent, his family. So pretty much it's just reporters asking, you know, what happened to the story? Why did it just disappear? De Borchgrave says the big names involved in the callboy ring have yet to emerge. We will only name people once we're satisfied with the documentary evidence, he said. Of course! The fact that 9 male prostitutes tell you they've slept with so-and-so, that's not enough. Yeah. Okay. July 10th story named as two of Spence's former friends, United States Attorney Joseph DeGenova and his wife Victoria Tonising, a former Deputy Assistant U.S. Attorney General. A color snapshot of DeGenova and Tonising at a July 4th party last year was featured on the Times front page above the story. I have no idea the relevance that Joe and I went to a 4th of July party with decent, nice people, said Tonising. It's obvious that Craig Spence was living a double life, but we were never part of that life. Yeah, okay. Yeah. And this is the last story. Male prostitute ringleader enters plea, framing Henry Vincent as the ringleader, not Craig Spence. Very interesting. Henry Vincent, of course, went to prison. But yeah, Craig Spence was not the leader, and Henry Vincent did not answer to Lawrence E. King and Craig J. Spence. He did it all on his own. He was the mastermind. See how they frame it? It's so bullcrap. The transcript, January 1991, January 23rd. Male prostitution ringleader enters plea. The leader of what authorities say was the Washington area's largest male prostitution ring has pleaded guilty to a number of charges, including racketeering, credit card fraud, and money laundering. Henry W. Vincent of Williamson, West Virginia, pleaded guilty Tuesday before United States District Judge Harold Green in connection with his role as ringleader of the enterprise, which served hundreds of customers in District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. And it was the reason why he joined Narconon was to get in good favor with Green, so his sentence would be reduced. Prosecutor said the ring operated the house in 34th Place in Northwest in the Chevy Chase area. Among the clients of the ring were advertised local newspapers under such name as Man to Man and Dream Boys, with Washington socialite Craig J. Spence. A well-known party giver, Spence was found dead in a Boston hotel room last fall when authorities have ruled a suicide. The ring received notoriety in a series of stories in the Washington Times, which reported the ring has served some low-level Bush administration officials. The newspaper also said the ring was operated with the aid of credit card accounts established in the names of other businesses. Spence had helped arrange a late-night tour of the White House for some rings and prostitutes who worked for the ring. United States Attorney J.B. Stevens said the investigation revealed no evidence of ties to anyone, of course, with any political or military organization, with the exception of several federal employees whose names have already been made public. Vincent was the last of the 4 defendants in the case to plead guilty. On January 5th, Robert Chambers, 39, of Upper Marlboro, Maryland, pleaded guilty to money laundering and credit card fraud. 2 days later, James A. Macco, he worked for the Chambers Funeral Home, Vincent did, and they were, all the credit cards that they were using for the ring, they were pushing it through that funeral home. I do believe Vincent and that Chambers didn't, I don't think he knew what it was for. 2 days later, James A. Macco, 29, of Michigan, and James Travis Smith, 23, of Florida, pleaded guilty to violations of the Mann Act. Ooh, so white slave trafficking. Interesting. Alright, that's it for this stream. We're going to do another stream on Henry Vincent eventually. We're going to read news articles pertaining to him. We're going to read articles pertaining to excerpts from his book as well. And I'll maybe do another stream on Spence if I get more information about him. I'll wait till next time. Continue reading the documents.